I didn't want to oversleep. Our Humanity in the Balance is my very small international nonprofit, and on our banner page it says we will go where we need to go to either stop a genocide or prevent one. Now, it's not as easy as that sounds. It's actually quite difficult, and it's rarely been done. But we decided to set the bar pretty high for ourselves, and what it's done is kind of wired our thinking in terms of looking for alternatives to the conventional ways of approaching genocide. We're going to say genocide a lot during this coming hour, but I want to make it clear that genocide for the most part is a legal term, but I'm going to use it in the generic sense because there are iterations of mass atrocity crimes like ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and of course genocide. But I think if I use the word genocide, I think it's easier for you to understand the scope of the violence and the horror, even though for each of these iterations, when you're on the receiving end of a machete blow or a bullet, it all feels the same to you. I got into this, Our Humanity in the Balance was a product of mine about 6 years ago. I got exposed to the issue in 1994-95 when I did a documentary on the Rwanda genocide for the United Nations, specifically UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and that's where I got sensitized to the issue. And then years later, in 2003, I saw that Darfur was beginning to make the news, and that there was an emerging genocide there. So these actions were either before you were born or you were toddlers at the time. But we can go into these because you've studied other genocides, I'm sure. But anyway, when I saw the Darfur thing emerging, I didn't pay close attention to it because I thought, okay, we learned the lessons that we needed to learn from the Rwanda experience. But as years passed, nothing actually changed. So I was at a point where I had just finished a documentary on military chaplains, and I thought after that experience, I would spend a lot of time with vets in veteran hospitals and contributing how I could to the issue for them, which was the different types of emotional trauma. But when I saw that no action was being taken in Darfur, I did a pivot, and I got re-engaged with genocide. When I was in Congo, there was a civil war going on. That was kind of a direct descendant of the Rwanda genocide. When I was in Congo, there was basically a world war. There were armies from 7 different countries there, and I resolved while I was there that I would do everything I could to stop the war, and I woke up with that thought every single day. But when I saw what was happening in Darfur and Darfur, and then that nothing was happening in Darfur to intervene, I changed my thinking to I will do everything I can today to stop a genocide, and that's how I've come to this issue in the way that I have. I saw that the conventional means that were attempted to stop genocide were not working. Letters to congressmen, meetings in the Oval Office, marches, demonstrations, petitions, nothing changed. Their meetings with congressmen, although they were very sympathetic, it never was sufficient to get our government to intervene to stop killing basically anywhere. And in the book, Samantha Power's book, genocide in America in the 20th century, she establishes that in the last 140 years we have done nothing to intervene in any, with one exception, and that was in Kosovo. And that was only because President Clinton's senior staff shamed him into it, saying that Rwanda has happened on your watch, Bosnia has happened on your watch, you do not want a third genocide on your watch. So that's the only exception that we've had to intervene. Genocide is, and again I'm using the word generically, it's becoming to be a larger part of our global experience. When you think about what's going on in Eastern Congo, the 3 genocides in Sudan, Darfur being one, the attempted killing of the Nuba people in the Nuba Mountains and the residents of the Blue Nile State. There are 3 contiguous genocides in Sudan. And the world has gotten numb to it. Right now, the U.S. has sent a trade delegation to Khartoum to work out trade deals with the government of Sudan. And the president of Sudan is a man who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court, war tribunals, for war crimes. I don't get where the world is right now. And I'm not happy with how my generation is leaving you to solve all of this. I can't believe we're giving you the world that's in this condition. And by the way, I've got your questions. And what I've done is group them together so maybe 1 or 2 questions can be answered at the same time, but also to kind of create a flow. But in terms of flow, I want you to feel free to interrupt at any time if you have a question, okay?
Great.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I may have to,
so anyway,
I may have to step in so that you can hear them, right?
Right.
So
okay.
If someone asks a question and you can't hear it, just let us know.
I think it's worth repeating the question anyway, so everyone hears it.
Okay.
But anyway, I got involved in a way that most people in the field don't approve of, because I don't think that the conventional ways are working, and they aren't working. My organization, based on my own observations and experiences, and the observations and experiences of people who I trust and respect in Africa, we have decided to take another approach, and that is direct action in the field, and that can take a lot of shapes. But we have a working model called IR2P, which is short for Individual Responsibility to Protect, which is a riff on the United Nations Responsibility to Protect Resolution of 2005. They have a great resolution to protect, but they've never acted on it, with maybe 1 exception. So anyway, our group decides for ourselves what we want to do to stop it. We've made some strategic allies in important places, and we have 2 focus areas right now. One is Sri Lanka, as a place that we think we can prevent a genocide. It's had a civil war, very ugly and genocidal ending to that war, and it looks like it's ramping up to a repeat of that. And where we think we can stop one is the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. So that's our 2 focus areas, and our criteria for the focus areas is access and potential for impact. We have to be able to get into a place, and we have to persuade ourselves that there's actually something that we can do. So I think I touched a little bit on one of the questions, and that was what led you to choose this career path. And I was motivated by my own personal experience that here's what it came down to, that I thought I had a plan that would work, and I asked myself, what kind of person would I be if I didn't try it? So that's where I'm at. My approach and our organization's approach involves a lot of moving pieces in terms of people being in certain places at the right time. So I've had to be very patient while this happens, because these pieces are in different countries. And if you weren't in this line of work, what would you be doing? Well, I like creative writing and I like film work. So I've written a lot of scripts, I've written a lot of stories, and I like film work. So I think something in that line would be very satisfying to me. And someone, I'd like to know who asked this, you said activist fatigue is common in the absence of successes. The world wants and needs a success. Close quote. What would the ideal success be? Who asked that?
Drake.
Okay, it's really, what is your name?
Drake. Drake.
Greg?
Drake.
Drake. Okay, sorry, Drake. Okay, Drake. It's really rude to throw people's own words back at them. Come on, I'm trying to keep it light here. Right? What does it look like? To me, it means a success means that someone did something, not just me or anyone, or someone actually did something to stop killing. It's that simple. I've had meetings in the United Nations with the people as part of their genocide hierarchy. They have a whole wing of the UN dedicated to this subject, and they don't have anything in their quiver. I mean, they don't have options. And this gets to one of the other questions about how I would change things. I think one of the stumbling blocks is the Security Council. And I think one thing that I would recommend to make it easier to intervene would be Security Council reform. Right now, one of the P5, the principal 5 countries, can veto any kind of effort. And in the case of Sudan, which is strategic allies with both China and Russia, we can't get any intervention plan for Sudan. I mean, that's just off the table. So I think there's not a lot that anyone can do as long as there is a lack of political will, and that seems to be the problem always. Like in Syria, in Eastern Congo, and in Sudan, in Burma, there's just, for a government to take action to stop something, they'd like to get allies, and you're talking about available resources, what kind of military are we talking about? These conversations tend to be lengthy, and because once a genocide flares, it can be over before a decision is ever made. So. Any questions yet? When looking at here's another question. I'm sorry?
I have a question. So we watched Daniel Goldhagen's film Worse Than War.
Yeah.
And he talks about creating like an international military force that could strike rapidly. And he also argues that if you strike rapidly against leadership, that can prevent some of these actions. Are you familiar with that idea? I'm sure it's not his alone. And could you speak to that in terms of what you just said about the P5?
I've actually seen very detailed plans at the UN for that kind of intervention force, and it's been headed by Dr. Robert Zuber. I've had several meetings at the UN with Bob Zuber, and he's been pushing this thing for years, and it's very frustrating for him because, again, what the holdup is the Security Council. what the plan that's out there is having two separate forces of about 5,000 troops in each one, and it is a direct hire force. In other words, these are people who actually work for the UN, and they're just not seconded to them by participating countries. And he would hire, in his plan, he would hire only military professionals, and that would include combat troops, plus support troops, communications, and intelligence people. But they would have them staged around in different parts of the world, mostly two parts, where they thought the likelihood was greater than perhaps other places. And they would be subject to, they would have latitude with the approval of three key people in the UN having nothing to do with the Security Council to take military action to head something off, subject to Security Council approval after 6 months, so they have a chance to evaluate the action. But this is an idea that I have seen. I've been in long meetings about how my group actually fit, even though we don't have a military component, at least for now, to our plan, because they really are trying to be holistic about this, that there are civilians who have capabilities that could be useful in an intervention. So yes, that plan has been around for quite a while, but it's just getting nowhere.
Looks like we got a question right there.
Please.
So I've been looking at the Darfur genocide for the last couple of weeks, and I guess I'm kind of struggling on how that they came to the classification of genocide for the Darfur. Obviously, I haven't been there, but on paper it looks a little bit more like territorial wars, stemming from a class conflict, stemming from a religious war. So, I mean, the U.S. is the only country in the world to classify as a genocide, and I don't even think the UN has. And I believe the U.S. classified as a genocide so it could get into South Sudan's oil resources. Because, I mean, the U.S. has an overwhelming approval rating in South Sudan opposed to China or Russia, both of which are involved with Sudan. So I guess that's my question on what qualifies Darfur as a genocide.
That's a good question, and there are people who have been reluctant to call it a genocide, but I would call it a genocide, and here's why. One of our directors, if you've been to our about page, you will see that the first one there is Dr. Mukesh Kapila. He's well known to Sudanese. He was the senior UN official in Khartoum in 2003 when UN people were starting to filter reports back from Darfur about raids and attacks on villages, arbitrary executions, raping women, throwing kids into fires. And these reports kept coming in and kept coming in and kept coming in. And he would pass these reports on to UN New York and UN in Geneva. And when the tallies came in over a period of time, it turns out that there were a couple of million people displaced within Darfur, and the number of people who are reasonably expected to have been killed is about 400,000 now. And when you're talking about an area like the 3 states of Darfur, it's not densely populated. It's not like Rwanda was. So to displace 2 million people and kill almost 500,000 people, and I'm not rounding up just to make it sound worse, because there's the 400,000 is a conservative number. I mean, that's a lot of people in a very sparse area, and they're being targeted. And you mentioned that it's not religious. It's not religious. This started off as being a resource competition. That the herders were, and this is part of climate. It has to do with climate. The herders were having problems finding sufficient pasturage for their cattle and camels, and the cultivators, the ones who are being targeted, they were losing their land to the herders. Now the herders are more ethnically connected to the ruling elite in Khartoum, and the cultivators are not. So yes, there is a question among some people about, does this really qualify? I mean, I don't have a question about it. The people I work with don't have a question about it. The people who study it, I mean, I'm not a genocide scholar, but genocide scholars who study this, people who I know have been there, say this is a genocide, because it's basically the Darfuris who are being targeted are either killed or rounded up. They're certainly displaced, and right now many tens of thousands are camped in IDP camps, internally displaced people for protection by UN, a peacekeeping force. But many more than that have crossed over the border into Chad. And most of the people who fled the country, the ones who are technically refugees, are in Chad. There are some in the CAR as well.
I guess follow-up question to that. I guess. So I asked a question. I don't know if I got into it on does genocide, is it dependent on agenda? So especially in Darfur, it seems like everyone has an agenda. So the agrarian society is sponsored by the rebellious group of South Sudan, and they're in Sudan. So the point, I think, of Omar, the president, is to get them out of Sudan, which is why he employed the Janjaweed to remove them from Sudan, because they're encroaching on his territory. And I'm pretty sure the Janjaweed haven't always been favored in Sudan, because they're part of Gaddafi's group way back when he was he employed them to create the belt, the Islamic belt. So Sudan wasn't a huge fan of them because they were trying to, take over Sudan. So, and then the cattle herders, I mean, whatever they are, the herders, I don't know if they herd cattle, they need land. So, I mean, they seem kind of like mercenaries for land. So their agenda is land, but, I mean, everyone seems to have an agenda. I mean, America's agenda, it seems to be, is oil in South Sudan, creating infrastructure to extract the oil. China's agenda seems to get the oil out of Sudan, which is exporting 2/3 of their oil to China. I mean, Russia's just there for kicks and giggles affairs. But, I mean, what I guess, is it dependent on agenda, or is it dependent on just people are dying?
I think it can begin as an agenda. The Janjaweed, who are now, their ranks are being supplemented by Libyan mercenaries, but they were Sudanese initially, and this is kind of covered in other questions about what motivates people to do the things they do, and the leadership has offered, and we know this in retrospect, that Khartoum has offered the Janjaweed land if they would do such and such. So their motivation was land, but it was used as an inducement to do the things that they did. And their brief from above was to do whatever it takes to accomplish that. So the Darfuri, I mean, they're not fools. I mean, they started resisting, and there were 3 separate Darfuri resistance groups. So that kind of raised the notch into open warfare, and usually in today's warfare, and this is probably something that you studied and realize already, but in today's warfare, 90% of the casualties are civilians, and 90% of those are women and children. So that's how you get where we are right now. And also the Sudan's association with China and Russia. In the Nuba Mountains, which is contiguous with southern Darfur, there's really rich gold deposits. And the gold deposits have already been, the rights to mine that have been sold to China already. And China, very sensibly, says that, you know, we like to mine it, but you get rid of you get rid of the occupants because we don't want to fight them. So that's it's crazy out there.
Other questions? I just have a general question, Terry, and this is just related to what part of the senior agenda here. What do you think are, like, I get discouraged when I find that a lot of people, when they're researching, they discover American fingerprints all over these things. What do you think our social responsibility is as Americans? And what should we take on as a social responsibility as a citizen?
Okay.
It's kind of broad, but part of the senior focus is that.
And it was not a softball either. Just so you know, the United States has had a reputation for making a lot of foreign policy choices and decisions based on moral issues. We took a moral stand on a lot of these larger questions. That is not as true anymore. And I think it's a result of the growing power and influence of the international corporations, particularly in energy and fossil fuel. And a lot of, they have a lot of influence. And it's harder to find a moral side to many of the decisions that we make. It's hard to tell the U.S. apart from most of the other countries anymore. And I say this as someone who's lived many, many years overseas, and I've seen how other countries behave. I've seen how our own country has behaved, and I really don't like the trend line that we're on. So for us to make business deals with a war crimes indicted president in a country that's got 3 simultaneous genocides, to me, it's not acceptable to me. It's not acceptable to people I work with, and I would like to change it. Maybe that can be changed at the ballot box. I don't know. And one of the things I hope we have time to discuss is what you think, where you think our country is right now on these stages of genocide by Dr. Stanton. That I find them always found them very enlightening. Now, before he wrote the 10 stages of genocide after I had my own Rwandan experience, and at the time there were no 10 stages, but there were what they were loosely called as precursors, things that happened before genocide started, and so I refer to them as precursors and stages. And both their stages and precursors in the United States, and I think that even the presence of one should be a cause for alarm. But again, this is part of why I really regret that my generation is leaving you with this. Let's see. When looking at the stages, when looking at the 10 stages of genocide, what is 1 or 2 stages you would say impact the start of a snowball effect towards genocide? When you think of the stages, I know they're stacked there one after the other, but they're not necessarily linear. They don't always happen one after the other. And also, when you are on those stages, when a country is having those stages, it doesn't mean it's going to end up violently. It doesn't mean there's going to be a genocide. It doesn't mean that it's going to be mass atrocity crimes. But they are causes of concern, and hopefully wiser people can nip it in the bud. But I would say 2 things. The 1 or 2 stages that I would say have the strongest impact towards a violent end is the introduction of death in public discourse, political public discourse, and naming a victim. I say those two things would be key. Let's see, are there any areas that are more prone to genocide, I guess, than others? If so, why do you believe this? If not, what's a location you would say has suffered the most severely? I would say that there's no area that's really immune to it. Europe has had 2 genocides in the 20th century. 3 if you count Kosovo. Africa's had its share of problems. Asia's had Cambodia, now Burma. The Middle East, Syria is probably the best example. And in what area do I think it's suffered the most? I think it's Africa. Africa's got a lot of colonial baggage that is still sorting through, and there are different countries aligned with different former colonies, and a lot of the results of colonialization is having different groups held higher artificially by the colonizers than other groups, and which created a lot of internal tension that wasn't there before. Another question, Slobodan Project committed suicide at his trial. My thoughts? I had another cup of coffee when I heard that. I think a lot of Germans poisoned themselves after the Nuremberg trial, and because they didn't want one of 2 things. They didn't want to spend the rest of their lives in jail, and they didn't want to be executed. So they chose poison as a way out. There was a question at the time in the case of Projak of how he got the poison. And maybe that's been answered by now, but I don't know. Maybe his lawyer brought it in or somebody, but someone had to provide the poison to him. So that was his decision. Good riddance. Let's see more of that.
Well, these 2 questions. Do you guys have the questions?
I think Drake has a question.
If they were to make an international force, who would come together, or would countries come together to create the force? Who would provide the forces needed to create the international force to stop genocide?
Did you hear that?
Oh, the plan as contemplated would be professional soldiers from different member states of the United Nations would be recruited, and they would be paid directly by the UN, and they would once they joined that force at the UN, they would no longer be part of their own national force. Okay, so these are not troops that are contributed or on loan. These are independent professional soldiers who have experience, and the idea would be that the UN would try to make it as appealing as possible. In other words, there would be a lot of status given to people who were part of this force, in the hope that it would attract a lot of talented professional military people. But it would not be a case of a given country or more a bunch of countries donating troops, and that they would be recruited as individuals and not units.
And then the leadership would be based in the UN?
It would be UN leadership too. And like we have, there would be civilian oversight of these units. But I think in terms of it ever getting any ground, I think I think the odds are against that kind of force. But as the world continues to go down this violent path, they might rethink that, and maybe the Security Council will come up with something to appease a lot of countries are really concerned about what's going on. Even China and Russia are, even though they're in their own way contributing to it, just like we have in a couple of cases. There might be a way to appease the people who are funding the UN. I know we would like to have some say-so in how we can stop these genocides. Now here are 3 questions. I'm going to try to talk about them together. The 3 questions are: how can any group believe that they are superior to another group to the point they would choose genocide as an option to get rid of them? Another question: what drives people to choose a violent path over discussions or other methods? Does pride ever play a part in the final choice? Third question: can just one leader change the way a country thinks or acts? How do you think that one leader is able to? These are all connected. The thing about pride, I think it's less pride than ego. A lot of leaders who are in this position have enormous egos. They think they have the answers. And how can one leader change the way a country thinks or acts? And that is appeal to things that motivate potential followers. A very good way to do it is appeal to their fears and provide answers to those fears. And it's usually by blaming a group. Okay, now this is what you're going through, and this is why you're afraid. It's because of this other group. And it starts off as simply as that, and then it gets momentum, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Then this is where the stages come in. So, can one leader do it? Well, not by himself, but one leader can attract simpatico thinkers, and collectively, they can change the way a country acts and thinks. What do you think the next potential genocide will be?
Are you asking us?
Yes.
What do you guys think? Phelps, what do you think?
Oh.
Pretty broad. Jacob?
Probably Myanmar.
So Jacob says there's a vote for Myanmar. Kennedy?
Okay, that's a good vote. I mean, it certainly looks like it's becoming one right already.
Jeremy?
I don't really know.
No? Iris, what do you think? We're sticking with Myanmar, but I'm not hearing much else. You know, obviously Griffin's concerned right now with Darfur. I think that right now I see a lot of uncertainty out there.
There's a lot of it, the international news is full of potential ones. If you learn, if after you've studied this, you become more sensitized and more aware of how to recognize certain things. There's a lot of things going on in Yemen, for instance. There's a lot of stuff that is not good going on in South Sudan, where they're pitting the Nuer against the Dinka and vice versa. It's getting ugly in several places, and it's frankly more than the world can handle. So,
well, that's really important. How do you combat information fatigue or apathy or people just feeling plain overwhelmed and not wanting to hear about it? As an organization, I mean, is there any way you can help sensitize people to what's going on? Sorry, I don't ask light questions.
No, that's I'm thinking about it, Keith. How do you do it? Well, I mean, I do what I can at the margins. I don't command an army, but I do at the margins the best I can. I'm happy to talk with the students of Mount Desert Island High School, for instance, and maybe stimulate one or two of you as you you cross the threshold into adulthood, that you keep what you have learned from this course of study in your senior year tucked away in a place that you can recall. And maybe as each of you gets into positions of responsibility and are in a position to influence or contribute to a discussion, you call up what you've learned and contribute that. A lot of people in the world do things just because they don't know better. Okay, ignorance is common. No matter where you are, there's people who just don't know why they're doing what they're doing, or why it might be bad, or that they shouldn't talk that way. I remember, speaking of words, I remember growing up. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, that's not true. There are a lot of, one of the stages is having a media outlet that promotes what's going on. In Rwanda, for instance, the one I have more direct experience with, the radio station Nickelson, which is French for 1,000 Hills, their presenters were using very insightful language to incite people to violence. Words have power. Words have power for good, but they also have power for evil and bad. And so when you hear people talking, and you can do this at any age, including right now, but if you hear people talking dismissively about a group of people, whether it's background or religion or economic status or you name it, I mean, you guys are attuned to this, say something. The school system in Florida has been teaching the Holocaust and the genocide studies for the last 20 years, and they teach it down to the grade school level. And the way they always introduce it is through anti-bullying, because they see that as a good first step. Okay, you guys have a lot of power, and you just don't know about it. You just don't realize it yet, but you have a lot of power. And when you get older and you have more experience and you have an evolved world view about how connected the world is to everything that you're doing, if you have that appreciation, you're going to be in a position to say something and actually influence people. This subject is relevant to your everyday life here in America, especially with the changing political climate. Everything that we're talking about genocide, it's relevant in our own country right now. Pay attention, please.
Yeah, Drake has a question.
So for Myanmar, for instance, what does your organization do or take for your first steps to try to prevent anything from growing? If you have taken steps, what are they? If you haven't, what would you do first?
Was that specific about Burma, Myanmar?
Yeah.
Or in general? Okay, well, we don't have access to anything in Burma, and I say Burma because I don't want to give the military junta their credit for renaming their own country. Rohingya, there's no way to get in there. The Karen group on the northeast side, they're under attack all the time. There is a military resistance there, and there's nothing we can contribute to that because they're actually doing a really good job. The Burmese military are not successful in getting into that part of the country, which is, I think, The Karen live in the area called Cochin. But Rohingya, it's tough to get in there. Now, what we have done in Sri Lanka, to give you an okay, this is an example from our pages. This is what we are doing. In Sri Lanka, there was a 28-year-long civil war, and in the final days, the government troops pocketed the Tamils from which the rebels were. I mean, the rebels were Tamils, so all the Tamils in the country got put into the same basket. They killed about 200,000 Tamils, unarmed civilians, in the last few days of that. So that was a mass atrocity crime. And I don't think there's much debate about what it's called. It was an ugly finish to a civil war. But we're seeing signs now that the things that started that war to begin with, which was pogroms of the radicalized Buddhist priests and the majority of Sinhalese, were targeting minority Tamils. Well, those same behaviors are now directed at Sri Lankan Muslims. Random killings, burning of mosques, burning of stores. So what we have done, and we don't know what's going to see, but we to the embassies in the the American, British, and Canadian embassies in Colombo, a plan that creates a very significant link between the targeted population, here now Sri Lankan Muslims, and the key economic sector in the Sri Lankan's economy. The largest foreign exchange earner for Sri Lanka is tourism. So our plan that we pitched was to create tourist agencies, tour companies, guides that would appeal to foreign tourists, and including do home visits, visit cultural sites, historic sites, and provide transportation to get tourists at these different places on a continuous basis, because and does two things. Number one, it links the targeted population to a key economic sector. So if they damage one, they're going to damage the other. But also the fact that there are tourists going to these cultural sites, these historic sites, puts witnesses in place which can mitigate against violence. One thing I learned from reading Romeo Dallaire's book, who was the Canadian commander of the peacekeeping force in Kigali, Rwanda, witnesses have power. Killers don't want to kill in front of witnesses. They don't. So that was our plan, and right now we're going to see what actually it can achieve or not achieve.
Other questions? I have a question. What about Central America, and what do you know about, say, the 1970s and 80s in Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and why is it that the United States has never identified those as genocide? In particular, the Mayan.
Yeah. People who follow the issue have no trouble calling it a genocide, because that in southern Guatemala, Mayans, particularly Mayan women, were targeted randomly and just killed. And people who are in the field, and people, and genocide scholars and activists, they have no trouble calling it for what it was. But to move the government to call it something like that, it's a different thing, because there are a lot of political considerations. Whose toes are we stepping on? And particularly in Nicaragua during the 80s, when we were arming the rebel group, and I was in Central America at the time, even very, very close to where that was happening, and it was very hard to get information about it. I knew there was stuff going on in the country next door, but again, there was a lid on everything. I later became friends with the State Department person who was the liaison to the rebel group, and he feels very loyal to the rebels and attributes a lot of the killing to the Sandinistas. But you know, I never got my head around what happened in Nicaragua and El Salvador. That was just a long civil war against a very oppressive regime. And one of the aftermaths of that war, and the war's over, but the killing is hardly stopped because there was a vacuum and it's been filled by really ugly gangs. I have an in-law, my niece's husband was a journalist down there, and he had access to the gangs because he was seen as being neutral. But he showed me photos of people beheaded, and it just gets ugly. A lot of the killing is it's more than just killing. There's a debasement about it that is just really evil, and a lot of another thing that is part of one of the stages or precursors is that you start referring to your potential victims in less than human ways. So the perpetrators no longer see the victim's humanity, and I think that came through in the film Worse Than War. That when that one Rwandan killer talked about killing his neighbors, and he said, you know, they weren't people to us. They just weren't people to us.
Right. Griffin?
Well, you said something interesting about the Sri Lanka case, about how you went in and you made it you made an incentive economically to not kill the other group, which is kind of interesting, because as opposed to broadcasting, which you might have done, you could have broadcasted media to portray what's going on, but you made it, and you incentivize not killing as opposed to incentivizing killing. So, I mean, is that the best way to go about genocide? Because, I mean, we look at the U.S., which in Sudan, I mean, I only know about Sudan because that's the only thing I've researched. It was unanimously voted a genocide, which makes sense in my mind, whether it's a genocide or not, because South Sudan has the biggest oil resource in Africa, and China is outsourcing its oil, Sudan's outsourcing its oil to China. So the best way to undercut China is to make sure that South Sudan is independent, loaded up with infrastructure, and cut Sudan out from the middleman, which makes sense to me. But is that why, I mean, would that be the best method of getting people to recognize that it is a genocide? Would you say that if oil wasn't involved in Sudan, would anyone really, not necessarily care, but would any political entities really have such a big involvement? You see the three biggest superpowers in the world involved in this, you know, desolate country in the middle of Africa, which there has to be a reason for that, as opposed to Myanmar or Guatemala or all those places where you can't even get a country to acknowledge it's a genocide.
Yeah. I'm glad that your study of Darfur has spilled over into other parts of that area. And you mentioned South Sudan and Sudan's alliance. So the major oil field in that area is Abyei, which is right on the border between South Sudan and Sudan, and is highly contested. Right now, Sudan has control of that field, even though South Sudan claims it. But South Sudan is so caught up in its own internal issues and killing that they're not in a position to contest Sudan. So what Sudan has going for it economically is oil. They're not developing to any other part of their economy. There is no other sector that has weight. Now there's a growing agricultural sector, mostly in gum. Gum is an ingredient in a lot of different foods. And when I read about it, I was surprised how prevalent gum is in a large part of our diet. And Sudan is a major provider of that. So there's like a lot of agricultural companies, including chocolate companies, had really been lobbying against the sanctions because they needed the gum. They weren't getting gum anywhere else. So it's a very complicated situation.
But also, isn't Sudan's exports is refined oil, which they get from South Sudan. South Sudan's exports, which is like 90%, is crude oil, but they don't have a way of refining it, which is why they need Sudan at the moment. But I think the U.S.'s involvement is to make a refinery in South Sudan and then cut Sudan to the middleman, which would make sense to me. And then you'd also cut out China and Russia. You get all the oil. So that's what makes sense that they unanimously decided it.
Has the CIA contacted you yet?
Not yet.
No, but I think I think Wesleyan College has.
Yeah. Now your analysis is really, what is your name?
Griffin.
Griffin. Your analysis is very good. It's very accurate. I agreed with everything that you said. Yeah, that's good analysis.
Hey Terry, in the last few minutes we have, I'm wondering about like, I know I really shouldn't care about all this stuff, but what about at home? And we have this travel ban that was upheld last night. We had a president retweeting. I subjected this class to a shocking PBS NewsHour report that our president was retweeting hate speech from a group in England. Should we even care, or is this just like a media circus?
Well, it's definitely a media circus, and unfortunately our media is giving our president a platform that he doesn't deserve. I'm not objective about this, okay? So whatever I say, take it as such. I am not objective, but everything that I have seen happen elsewhere that had a bad end, we are seeing in our country today. And I raised, when I was in one of my meetings at the UN, it was in the office of the genocide people. And I don't mean that they're committing Jews. That these are the people who follow the issue. And I had learned before I got to this meeting. I've been up there several times. I had learned that the UN keeps a record, a file on every country and where they are on a scale or on a line to genocide. In other words, where is this country on the tipping over to genocide scale? Well, I had my own estimation of the stages at that point, and I asked, I said, what do you have a file on the U.S.? And he said, yeah, of course we do. I said, well, what does it show? And he said, I can't disclose that. And then he said something that I found very curious. He said, we think that the institutions in your country are strong enough to keep it from happening. To me, now maybe I read too much into it, but to me it indicated that there were some things that in maybe other countries would have been very serious, but they weren't quite as serious here because we had institutions that would stop that. I see an erosion of our institutions. I see around our country there are over 200 militia groups that have publicly stated that they're just waiting for orders from above. Do I think we're going to have a genuine genocide? No, I don't. We're not made that way. But I do foresee the potential for a lot of violence. There's a lot of police departments that have been taken over by white supremacists. I mean, that's alarming to me. Again, I'm not objective about this, so you have your own opinion. But this is what I see. I'm very alarmed. I don't know what to do about it. Here's the strange thing for me. As much as I have studied genocide in other countries, for the life of me, I never thought that I would be in a situation where I was feeling what the people in those countries must have felt as they saw it coming. But that's how I feel right now.
You guys, what else? Do you have any last questions for Terry before we let him go into the ionosphere? These guys have as a charge, as seniors, the focus of social responsibility. And it's taken various forms over the years. But that's one of the sort of the common threads through English social studies, and then seniors have a thing called Social Responsibility Day. And I really want to just maybe, if you could, just speak to that, like, you know, you turn 18, you become an American, you can buy pornography and cigarettes, but what is your social responsibility as an American? You know? Just out of curiosity. In all of
wow.
Stuff. I mean,
gee, Mr. Eaton, where do I start?
I'm trying to put something on these guys.
Okay, well, listen. The first thing I would say, and in all seriousness, do whatever Mr. Eaton says, okay, and you're good. Just imagine what a good person would do, and be that person. Okay, is that so hard?
I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think? Yeah. Kennedy?
Hey guys, thank you very much. It's been an honor to.
Thank you.
And hey, you've got, okay, this is your senior year. You've got a few more months. Hang in there and go out and have a great life, okay?
Thank you.
That's what I'm saying.
You too.
Okay.
Terry, thank you very much, man. You put in a lot of time here this morning.